And welcome to another exciting TIES webinar. TIES is the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science, and we prepare teachers K through 12 with free resources to teach evolution and biology and all the associated things that have to do with evolution. And today we're excited to have Kostas Kampourakis with us. He's going to be talking about Ancestry Reimagined. He's going to be talking about dismantling the myth of genetic ethnicities. His presentation will be about a half an hour. And if you are attending live, and if you're with a teacher, have them type in the questions in the chat box below. And at the very end of the presentation, I will direct the questions to him. And he's looking forward to a good discussion. So as the presentation's going on, if you have a thought, maybe write it down, and then you can slip it to your teacher, and we will discuss it.
Thank you very much, Kenny. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. So good evening from Geneva, Switzerland. I'm Kostas Kampourakis. I used to be a school teacher in Greece for 12 years, and now I'm teacher educator here in Geneva, which means that I always enjoyed and still enjoy working with teachers and with students wherever this happens. Now, whereas I've written books both about genetics and about evolution, this talk is about the latest one that is coming out next month, which is perhaps a combination of the knowledge that we have from both sides about human evolution and human heredity, and it has to do with the concept that is sometimes discussed and even more often misunderstood, which is about ancestry. This is the book I'm talking about. It will be out, as I said, next month by Oxford University Press, perhaps a little bit later in the US, but that's quite soon. So here's an overview of my talk. I'm not presenting the book. I'm presenting points and ideas that are found in the book, but I thought that I should address the questions that teachers and most importantly students may have, and the ones that they may bring in the classrooms. So I begin with the typical questions that the companies selling DNA ancestry tests ask you often. How much do you really know about who you are? And then I'm going to explain what ancestry is. I'm going to consider some research in psychology about how we tend to think about social groups. Then I'm going to turn into an important distinction, which I will explain later. And I will conclude with what exactly it is that DNA ancestry tests can tell us about who we are. Let us begin with the question. I begin the book with these two people, Karen and Jay, who were participants in the program back in 2016, organized by the travel agency Momondo and the company Ancestry, which is the largest one, selling DNA ancestry tests. And as you can see in these screenshots, Karen is crying, Jay is a bit puzzled, and the reason for this is that whereas they both thought initially that they have a single ancestry, the results that they received were mixed and most importantly, quite different from what they expected. Now, receiving mixed results is no problem at all because we are all related. There are no pure ethnicities or races or anything else. We're all a big family and no problem with that. The problem is that the tests that they received also told them that perhaps what they were told by their families was not entirely accurate. And here is the exact message with which the organizers advertise the program. Think you know where you come from. Think you know what you're made of. Our sense of identity stems from our upbringing, our culture, our family values, and the stories passed down from generation to generation. But how much do you really know about who you are and where you come from? And how does that influence how you look at the rest of the world? The implicit implication here is that, well, you may not know the truth about you. And here we are, we're offering you a DNA test to tell you the truth. Another important thing related to this is that the tests are marketed. They are quite cheap nowadays, and people even offer them for, as a Christmas gift to a friend. And the problem is that people are sometimes not prepared to understand and interpret the results. I have to note that especially the big companies like Ancestry and 23andMe, in their white papers, they are very transparent about what one should infer from the tests. They do not present the methods, but they explain what the tests can and cannot tell. They're very clear. The question is, do people really read these white papers? I'm not very sure. So what they give, here's the example from Ancestry, is what they call ethnicity estimates, which is something like an analysis of where your ancestors may have come from, where your origins are found based on your DNA. This is a bit problematic because it makes an assumption which is not correct. And here you see an old book that described this perception of the jigsaw theory and criticized it. It is the idea that we consist of separate pieces of a puzzle that altogether make us who we are and can explain our origins. But as I'm going to show, is not as simple as that. Same with 23andMe, that recently has switched from the focus on health to ancestry as well. They call their results an ancestry composition, but as you can see here, it is essentially the same. They give people percentages that reflect the possible origins that a person can have. Marketing continues, and other companies like Family Tree DNA emphasize, like the previous ones, of course, the low cost of the tests. They are quite affordable, not of course for everyone, but for many people who, for instance, would like to buy a Christmas gift. They're quite popular in Christmas. And there are different kinds of tests sold. As you can see here, this company offers paternal ancestry, which has to do with the DNA in the Y chromosome, maternal ancestry that has to do with mitochondrial DNA, but also family ancestry that has to do with the autosomes and the whole gene. In this way, a person can have different kinds of results accumulated in a report that can or are supposed to explain their ancestry. Now, some companies take things even further. And as you see here in the advertisement of MyHeritage, they write, your origins are encoded in your DNA and enable us to pinpoint where in the world your ancestors come from. Your DNA results will include an ethnicity breakdown and identify the specific groups you descend from among a number of regions. Well, today I'm going to argue that the origins are not really encoded in DNA, and so they do not really enable us to pinpoint where the ancestors live. The tests are very good at doing something else, to which I will come back in the end. Other companies take things even further, and this company here allows people to upload the raw data that they get from ancestry companies like Ancestry and 23andMe, and get what they call their ancient admixture, the percentage that goes back in time to Yanaya, East Asia, Africa, South Africa, farmers, hunter-gatherers, and Native Americans. And of course, there are others in the same spirit that it can even pinpoint, as in my case, ancient Greek origins and ancestries that go back in time. Well, honestly, I would be very excited if this were possible, but as I'm going to explain, it's not really possible to establish an ancestry across 4,000 years or more. Now, to understand what exactly this test can and cannot tell us, we have to consider what ancestry is. There exist different types of ancestry that may not be related. And in this great book that I strongly recommend that you read, Graves and Goodman make an important distinction between cultural ancestry, which refers to linguistic, social, cultural, and religious traditions that an individual feels connected to, which is very important. Geographic ancestry, which refers to the place or places where an individual's ancestors came from. Genetic ancestry, which refers to the connections that an individual has to other people through their DNA. And to all this, I would add that we also need to consider genealogical ancestry, which refers to all the identifiable ancestors in the family tree of an individual, which is what all genealogists deal with, and all analysis about genealogy deal with. So the first thing to note is that there are different conceptions and concepts of ancestry, and these are sometimes even overlapping, yet we should be careful not to confuse them. Now, the two key concepts that we have to very carefully consider are these two. Genealogical ancestry, which, as I mentioned, refers to the identifiable ancestors in your family tree or pedigree. So you are here and you have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on. And genetic ancestry, which does not refer to your pedigree, but to the subset of paths through it by which the material in your genome has been inherited. And this has a very important implication. Simply put, whereas we have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 grandparents, and goes like this, every generation will have 2 times more ancestors. This does not mean that we inherit DNA from all of them. And this is due to a phenomenon that we all learn in basic biology in school, which is called crossing over. During meiosis, a cell division that occurs in the reproductive cells, which results in, as we say, haploid cells with half the number of chromosomes and DNA, there is an exchange that can occur here between homologous chromosomes, which results that in having chromosomes which are combination of the genetic material of our ancestors. Now, scientists have estimated the number of crossing over events per generation, which is about 71, a little bit more for mothers, 43, and a little less for fathers, 28, which entails that since k generations back, there would have emerged 44 plus 71 times k chromosome segments from all our ancestors in that generation. This means that 1 generation back, our parents, there could have been about 115 chromosome segments, always combined in the 46 chromosomes that we receive. 2 generations ago, our grandparents, we have a number that goes up to 186, and this goes on like this until 10 generations ago, where the theoretically possible number of our genealogical ancestors is 1024, and the number of different segments is estimated to be 754. Beyond that, the number of segments does not increase in the way exponentially in the way that the number of ancestors increases, which entails that 20 generations ago, we may have had more than 1 million ancestors, but only 1,464 segments. This means that we will not have received nothing, almost nothing, from the majority of our ancestors. Now, you may be wondering, does each one of us have 1 million ancestors 20 generations ago? And the answer is yes, but these ancestors are not different individuals. As we go back in time, our family trees begin to fuse with one another because we all have relatives, more and more relatives the further back we go in time. And in the end, we don't need to have had 1 million individual ancestors each, because these were people that can be found in the same family tree. And this is a nice representation by geneticist Graham Cook, who has a very nice blog where he discusses these issues, where he shows that where a few generations ago we have had all these genealogical ancestors, only some of them are our genetic ancestors. From all these people, we have received only a small, we have received DNA from only a small portion of them. Of course, from our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents, but as we go back in time, these people become less and less. Which is the conclusion? First of all, not all of a person's genealogical ancestors are also their genetic ancestors, which means that there have been many ancestors in the past, in the remote past, from whom we have not received any DNA. Therefore, DNA ancestry testing provides information about only a few of a person's genealogical ancestors. Therefore, DNA ancestry testing cannot tell you who you really are, for the simple reason that our DNA today can only reflect those ancestors from whom we happen to inherit DNA, and not the others from whom we did not inherit any DNA. So, in other words, only a portion of our ancestry, of our genealogical ancestry, is reflected in our DNA. And Graham Coop with a colleague made an analysis using data from Europe, and this is a bit difficult to read, but the point here is that the further back we go in time, there is more and more overlap between the different ancestry categories that we can define. So their conclusion was that pairs of individuals across Europe are reasonably likely to share common genetic ancestors within the last 1,000 years, and are certain to share many within the last 2,500 years, because, as I said, the trees begin to fuse and interact as we go back in time. This means that there are thousands of shared genealogical ancestors in only the last 1,000 years, even between pairs of individuals separated by large geographical distances, which is something that at first sight seems counterintuitive. However, as 1,000 years is about 33 generations, and 2 in the power of 33 is far larger than the size of the European population, so long as populations have mixed sufficiently, by 1,000 years ago, everyone who has left descendants could be an ancestor of every present-day European. They focus on Europeans because, as even today, we have more data for people of European ancestry than for people from other continents, but gladly, this has begun to change. And of course, there have been studies in top scientific journals talking about ancient origins, like my country of origin, Greece, talking about the genetic origins of the Minoans and Mycenaeans and the genomic history of Aegean palatial civilizations being based on ancient DNA. Yet, as this is a story that goes back in time more than 4,000 years ago, it is really complicated to argue, as a reporter argued here, that the Greeks really do have near mythical origins as revealed by ancient DNA. I would be very glad if this is the case, but I'm a bit skeptical because this is a bit difficult to establish. Of course, in my case, I don't worry because I feel myself Greek. That's the country I was born in. That's the language I speak. That's the tradition I grew up. And I don't need DNA to establish anything like that. Historians have been critical of such conclusions. And here you can see an excerpt from a book by Patrick Geary, who is a medieval historian currently working on a project on genetic history. And he says here that Europe's peoples have always been far more fluid, complex, and dynamic than the imagining of modern nationalists. Names of peoples may seem familiar after 1,000 years, but the social, cultural, and political realities covered by these names were radically different from what they are today. And this is absolutely true. Polls today will tell you that most Greeks think of Christianity as a fundamental aspect of their ethnic identity, yet Christianity did not even exist 4,000 years ago. So what was Greek 4,000 years ago is not exactly the same what we describe as Greek today. Now, in the discourse about ancestry, we have 3 concepts that are often used: race, which makes explicit reference to common descent and visible biological characteristics such as skin color, which are considered as the primary markers of difference; nationality, which makes reference to a state and official documents; and ethnicity, which makes reference to a common descent and cultural characteristics such as language as the primary markers of difference. And this is the level that today the companies provide their analysis, because it goes at the final level of detail. You know, 2, for instance, white people who are US citizens could be of Irish or Italian ethnicity, and this is why this is supposed to provide a final level of detail. Now, the big issue here is that these groups, these are social groups, whether racial, national, ethnic, they are real, but they do not exist naturally in the biological sense. Rather, they're socially constructed, even though we can find some associations with specific biological traits. And what does this mean? I think the best example is how the US Census, that you probably know better than me, defines the various groups. And as you can see, since 1790 until today, The various categorizations have changed. Only white is perhaps the same across all time because white people established that, people of European descent. Here is actually a detailed picture. And this can only show that we have races, but how we define them can change across time. And this is why we can describe them as socially constructed. They do not have a biological basis, even though sometimes we can associate them with very specific biological traits. Now, why this matters? This matters because of an intuition and bias that psychologists call essentialism. And when this is applied to social groups, it can have results that emphasize the differences rather than the similarities among us. Now, psychological essentialism is a set of interrelated beliefs that particular categories distinguish between fundamentally different kinds of people, that the boundaries that separate these categories are strict and absolute, making the groups discrete or non-overlapping, that the individuals within the categories are physically and behaviorally homogeneous, and that variation within and between groups is due to internal factors, these are the essences, that are shared within a group and which differ categorically across the groups. And here, DNA is quite often a nice placeholder for these essences. So this is a bias that comes naturally to all of us. It is evident in young ages, it persists into adulthood. It seems that it's something that is probably learned rather than something that is innate, but the point is that it is there. And my concern is that ads like this, whereas they don't have to be explicitly, intentionally intending to promote such a view, they can be interpreted in this way. So look at this, for example. This says you could be Irish, more specifically, Munster Irish. If you apply this scheme to this ad, there is the danger that people might interpret this ad in this way, that Irish or Munster Irish is a distinct group that can be limited from others, otherwise there's no point in referring to such a group, that a person who is Munster Irish cannot also belong to another group, say being Connacht Irish, otherwise it is meaningless to say that one is Munster Irish if one could also be Connacht Irish, that there is something distinctive among Munster Irish people that makes them more similar to one another and more different from other categories, such as Connacht Irish, otherwise they could not be identified as such. And in the end, that being Munster Irish is something that we can find based on DNA. Otherwise, why should we take the test anyway? Which means that DNA is the essence of who we are. Now, attention, I'm not saying that the companies, again, intentionally do this. I'm just saying that given our biases, ads like this one could be interpreted in this way. And this is something that comes naturally to us because psychologists tell us that these essentialist views, which are very intuitive, serve two distinct functions. One is the cohesion function, in the way that it serves to define who we are and thus provides a sense of security due to one's belonging to a group and due to the group's uniqueness. And we all have the need to belong to social groups. And at the same time, even unconsciously and unintentionally, it serves a discriminatory function. It serves to distinguish between us and others, us and them, and justify a possible privileged status. So the point is that we have the tendency to make a distinction between us and them psychologically. And the problem is that sometimes, unintentionally, we may use the results of DNA ancestry testing to support these arguments. Of course, there can be variations across countries, and I present here a poll about how flexible people feel their nationality to be. Here are questions. Practically speaking, they ask people from various places whether a person of their own nationality would maintain that abroad, and whether a person who comes from that or the other place would be one of them. And here I plotted the results, and of course, these are averages. In all countries, there are people who are more or less essentialists, and the only thing I want to show here is the variation. There are countries who think that their people will not change abroad and the foreigners will never become like them. But as you can see, many countries are found here. They are non-essentialist about other nationalities, about immigrants, which in some sense is good. Nevertheless, what is important is the variation. And of course, we cannot say that all people are like this or like that. Cultural values matter a lot here. However, there are people who rely on the research that scientists do to naturalize distinctions, like the typical distinction between continental groups and races. This is a book by journalist Nicholas Wade that has been criticized a lot because he relied on genetical research of the time to suggest that whether we like it or not, races have biological differences. Races do have biological differences, but these are average differences. They're not delimited, they're not well-defined groups. As I will show in a moment, there's a continuum of all biological characteristics, and there's no way that we can separate people in any matter, in any way, to distinct groups. Now, what he relied on are the results like this. That's a complicated program to explain, but the point is that geneticists define how many different groups, how many different clusters they want the program to yield. And when the K was set at 5, they found 5 groups that very roughly corresponded to the continental groups we know. I say very roughly because, as you can see, in all cases, each column here is individual. We have more than one colors. It's quite rare to have a single one. So as the geneticists here concluded, genetic clusters often corresponded closely to predefined regional population groups or to collections of geographically and linguistically similar populations. Now, this view, unfortunately, has racist origins back in the 19th century, when people believed that the Europeans, and that's a Greek skull that is presented as, the exemplar of humanity, and then you see Africans and Aborigines presented close to primates, which of course is entirely wrong. The problem was that at the time, in order to justify slavery, European naturalists tended to argue that there is a difference in capacities among the various human groups. Of course, this is something that cannot be established, yet at the time it was a very popular view among people both in the US, like the Knott and Glidden I showed here, and in Europe. And they questioned the doctrine of the unity of the human race, which is of course a fact. We all are one species, one group, because they wanted to justify their practices. And to do so, they wanted to argue against even, mixed, as we call them, and that's not a nice word, matings among people, because they suggested that admixture would result in degradation, in the loss of purity of the white race. Unfortunately, scientists today continue to use the notion of admixture in their very nice intention to show that, there are no pure groups because we are all admixed. However, the problem is that to show this kind of admixture, you have to assume at some point that there were source populations which were not admixed. And as we wrote in a recent paper that this has just been published in Genetics, it is not possible to say that someone is, say, for instance, 2/3 European and 1/3 African, because this assumes that we can define what it means to be 100% European and 100% African. And of course, we can do this relatively, but in the end, we're all Africans because our species descends from Africa. So there's no absolute way to define this. Now, this is a big study from the database of 23andMe that shows exactly what I said. African Americans have different kinds of ancestry if we define ancestries as African, Native American, and European, and so do the so-called Latinos, and so do the European Americans, even though in this study, all participants self-reported a single ancestry or ethnicity category. Now, thinking that you have a pure ancestry and finding out that you have more than one, there's no problem. The problem is that when people think that these different kinds of ancestries can be defined in absolute terms, and they cannot. This artist here, Angelica Das, has taken photos of many people and has used her palette, color palette, to show the differences in color. And if you look at the whole this whole exposition, you will see that what we find in terms of skin color, which is the primary marker for race, is a continuum of colors. There are no blacks and whites. There's a continuum of colors, and this is absolutely natural because we are all related. And if we find clusters, this often has to do with the sampling we did. Now, in the end, in a subsequent study, the scientists I showed you here explicitly stated that our evidence for clustering should not be taken as evidence of our support of any particular concept of biological race. They said, in other words, that even if we found clusters, these depend on the assumptions we made, and they do not support any notion of biological race. Races exist, but they're not biological. And here I show you just an example in order for you to see more clearly that in most cases, all individuals were found to belong more or less to different groups. Other studies, since a landmark study from 1972 by Richard Lewontin, have shown that most genetic diversity is found within groups rather than between groups. And in other words, if you take any one of us, we will be mostly similar rather than different, independently of the continental group we come from. And more recent studies like this one, that is based on data from New York, shows that even though we can distinguish groups here, as you can see with the different colors, the overall picture is that there's a continuum of genetic diversity. And that is the true situation for our species. Now, people think that with Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA that do not recombine, we can find our ultimate ancestry. And usually we see representations like this, presenting haplotypes that go back in the past. But this is rather a misrepresentation. The true picture is here. The true picture is that there's no single haplotype in a single place. There's always variation. And an interesting example by Henry Louis Gates was very popular with the shows that he did about ancestry. As you can see, he would identify as African American, yet when they analyzed his Y DNA, it went to Ireland, and when they analyzed his mitochondrial DNA, it went to England. So even though he identifies as African American, the analysis of his Y DNA and mtDNA alone would present him as European, which of course is not the case. And the reason is that these two portions of DNA are less than 1% of our overall DNA. So the important point I want to emphasize here is that we have a distinction that is very useful to keep in mind between criteria of identity, which is the criteria with which we divide people to groups, and the indicia of identity that just indicate something. And it is important to distinguish between the definitional set of attributes, which are the criteria based on which we make the categorization, and the operational set of attributes, which are the indicia. And the important point is that the DNA markers that we use in DNA ancestry testing are indicia, not criteria for ethnicity. So if one of us or all of us take DNA ancestry tests, we may find results that correctly indicate where we come from, or we may not. If they correctly indicate that, that's good, but our DNA is not the criterion for the social group to which we belong. So if this is all the case, what is going on with this DNA test? And is there anything that they can do? Well, the tests are very good at finding close relatives. And exactly because recombination allows for larger segment in our close ancestors, it is very good for finding relatives, close relatives up to a few generations ago. And as you can see here, they were able to reconstruct a big family tree stretching back 5 centuries that links 13 million of people through descendant marriage. And what this shows is that, as I said in the beginning, we're all a big family. What happens here is that because of the recombination, in close relatives like these first cousins here, it is possible to find segments that have not been broken up, that were inherited from the same ancestor, and in this way to establish relationships, perhaps find a relative we did not know they existed. And the companies explain that very well, and they can even show with specific methods that we can identify between half siblings, full siblings, parent children, and identical twins. And this is where the tests have a real value. There have been cases of false paternity or of people who did not know much about their relatives. They were foundlings and they found information. And this is exactly where these tests are very useful. And as I argue in my book, I would suggest that the industry has to be rebranded to DNA family, not ancestry testing. So to conclude, how should we interpret the results of DNA ancestry testing if you have taken one? With caution. The first point to note is that DNA ancestry results are not really about your ancestry. They provide estimates, probabilistic estimates of similarities with people living today. Not all your ancestors, you have to remember, are represented in your DNA. The further back we go in time, the less we can find about our genetic ancestry, and the more intertwined our family trees become. Whether we receive results about a unique or a mixed ancestry, we should keep in mind that these are the most probable estimates and therefore relative. And finally, if you're told that you're Greek, Celt, Viking, Lombard, or Roman, you shouldn't get overly enthusiastic. Now, where the tests succeed and fail, they are very good at identifying particular individuals to whom we are genetically related, very well. They do not always are able to identify geographic areas where a person's ancestors lived. This can be perhaps quite accurate at the continental level, but below that, not very well. They can not estimate ancestry proportions for a person, that we are, as I said in the beginning, as if we are a jigsaw puzzle. These are estimates that have to be understood. The tests always give the most probable results, but not the only results. And with that, if you're interested in reading more, you can take a look at the book that's coming out soon. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
All right, thank you so much for that. Webinars are archived on our YouTube page. And about 2 years ago, we had a lecture, a webinar from Dr. Leslie Jones called One Under the Sun, Human Skin Color. And she also talked about how ethnicities and race are a construct that we have created ourselves. All right, one question for you, since we have students watching now live and they'll be watching the recording. For students who are exiting high school, and are interested in pursuing a field in genetics, what internships or opportunities or areas of study should they pursue?
Well, I think that it is very important for students who want to have a career in genetics to get input from other disciplines as well. And one good thing that you have there in the States, this doesn't exist in Europe yet, is that you have these minors and majors, and one can do both and get a variety of educational input, and learn a lot, about sociology, history, and also genetics. So I think that the key point is for the person to have as a broad education as possible, and not just focus, on genetics, even though they are interested in that, but try to understand better, for instance, what are these social groups we're talking about. So, of course, another advice would be read as much as you can. There are so many books out there, very good books by experts that explain these things. And the most important thing is that whereas until recently, for instance, geneticists and anthropologists and historians were fighting each other on these grounds, now there are many, many collaborations through which they try to explain things better to the broader public and contribute together to a better understanding of who we are and where we come from, because no single discipline can figure this out.
All right, very good. I think I accidentally answered this, but I'll have you answer it. Allison asks, is it fair to say that there's no such thing as a biological race or ethnicity, only social constructs?
Yeah, absolutely. There is no biological race, there's no biological ethnicity. What happens, of course, is for instance, take my case. I was born in Greece. I know for a fact that all my grandparents and great-grandparents were born in Greece and they lived there. And this is the criterion for the test. If your grandparents were born and lived in the same country, you qualify as Greek. Now, if we have people accumulated in a group we call Greeks like this, they will eventually end up having similar DNA results. But this doesn't mean that we know what happened 5 or 4 or 6 or 7 generations back. So the point is that we do not have, at least for now, sufficient data for what happened in the past. We establish a group of people living today and we compare test takers based on that. And this is why we have to be very careful with using, names that are used for social groups like ethnicity or race and things like that. Now, people may ask, but isn't it the fact that, people from Africa are black and people from Europe are white? Well, the answer is yes and no. We usually find people in Africa having a darker skin tone than people in Europe, but this doesn't mean that all Europeans have an entirely white skin tone, or that they have, a specific eye color. And we also find people outside Africa who have dark skin, for instance, in India and elsewhere. And we find people outside Europe who have a white skin. So the point is, whereas on average, we can estimate, we might be able to estimate the origin of some people. These are just estimates and average, because there is nothing in DNA that is the essence of one or the other race.
All right, very good. That other webinar that I mentioned, she highlights that the reason why people living in different areas of the world have different skin colors is an adaptation to the varying intensity of ultraviolet light. So that's a nice connection. If after this webinar you want to watch that one. All right, I don't believe there's any more questions, so we want to thank you, Kostas, for a wonderful webinar. And I will have a link to your book in the description as soon as it's available. And we look forward to reading it. And thank you, everyone, for watching live too. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I was delighted to be here, and I hope that talk was useful.
Very much so. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.